Welcome to the Startup of the Year podcast, where each episode we showcase exciting new companies from around the world. This podcast is produced by Established, creators of the Startup of the Year program. Established is focused on helping organizations with their innovation, startup, and communication strategies.
Welcome back to the Startup of the Year podcast. I'm Frank Gruber, the co-founder and co-CEO of Established, co-founder of Established Ventures, and the team behind the Startup of the Year community and this very podcast. Thanks for being here. We really appreciate it. And for those of you that are new to the podcast, maybe I met you last week out at TechCrunch Disrupt in San Francisco. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate you being here and finding us over at the podcast. And for those who have been listening to the Startup of the Year podcast for a while, we appreciate you too. And thanks so much for being here again. On this episode, I talk with Nate Andorsky. He's actually the founder of Effectual Ventures. It's a company that helps startups find and accelerate product market fit. Prior to Effectual Ventures, he's actually spent the last decade building an Inc. 5000 company and working with everyone from early stage startups to Fortune 500 companies such as Johnson & Johnson, CVS Health, Quicken Loans, and he helps ideating and bringing new products to the market. And he's also the author of a new book. It's called Decoding the Why, which dives into how social science is driving the next generation of product design and development. So we're going to talk about product development a lot today. And I'm excited because we don't talk about it as much as we should. So really cool topic and really interesting guy and background. So can't wait to jump right in. And for our listeners, actually, today you can grab a copy of his book, Decoding the Why, for free. So simply go to soty.link/decoding. I guess it's soty.link/decoding and enter the code SOTY and your email address, and it'll shoot you a copy of his book for free. So check that out, and hopefully you find it super helpful, and you can read it and follow along with the podcast as we jump right in. But before we do that and dive in, we're going to share a couple of housekeeping items for the Startup of the Year community. First, I wanted to share that we're hosting an event for the Startup of the Year community coming up here on December 13th. It's going to conclude our Grow Your Startup series. So for those of you not familiar, we've been doing a bunch of events over the last few months, and this will kind of wrap it up for the year. It's a virtual event, which will feature 5 companies from our community, and they'll be putting them to a virtual stage in front of investor judges and our global audience. And it'll be a lot of fun and should give them some great feedback and experience. So looking forward to that. If you're interested in the event and want to apply to be a part of it, just simply go to this link I'm going to share in a minute. Or if you want to register, you can register to be an attendee as well. Simply go to soty.link/growpitch.2022. And so it's soty.link/growpitch2022. You can also, I think, navigate to it from our Startup of the Year page as well. So we'll drop this in the show notes so you can find it more easily, though. We hope you can attend, or if you want to pitch, definitely apply right away. All right. And we're also, we want to celebrate and showcase startups in our community. So we're going to continue to do that on this episode. And so the company today is Spotively, which is a community management system that connects an organization's suite of community tools. And it's basically handles a full life cycle of community management, from workflow management to community insights, and has a number of different bells and whistles. So just to learn more, simply go to Spotivly.com, Spontivly.com. Again, Spotively.com. All right, now let's jump in and catch up with Nate about behavioral science and how to use it for product development and his new book. All right, so Nate, what are you doing over at Effectual Ventures? Can you share a little bit more about what you're up to?
Of course. So we work with early stage startups, and how I define that is basically if you are a startup that has a product in market and some users, you don't have to have a lot, helping these startups find or accelerate product market fit. So most of our companies are either pre-seed up to Series A.
Perfect. Sounds like our Startup of the Year community. So that's a great fit. Glad you're here today. And excited to talk to you because you got a book that's fairly new called Decoding the Why. And I started really diving into it and wanted to talk to you more about it because the folks here on our podcast that listen may not know everything about product development, and kind of dives into the behavioral side. So first off, just to set the base, like, how did you get started building products, just so everyone knows kind of your background?
Definitely. So I have a very entrepreneurial background. I've been doing entrepreneurial related things since I can remember. I had my first business in high school. And then coming out of college, I got more interested in web and mobile app development, worked for a few agencies and got my hands into just basically building products for companies. I love making sense out of chaos and putting together puzzles, and building products is very much that. So just the pure curiosity is what keeps me going.
I love that. Same here. I couldn't agree more. And so I wanted to ask you, like, when you built those products, what did you notice when you were bringing them to the market, and kind of maybe led to what you're doing now and kind of the book that you wrote?
Yeah, definitely. So I read a book actually about 5 or 6 years ago called Nudge, which is one of the most well-known books in the space of behavioral economics / behavioral science. And it just really seeks to understand what drives human behavior. And I was reading through the book, and given that I had an experience building products, I noticed that some of the concepts they were talking about, I had stumbled across or just learned through trial and error, right? So like paradox of choice is a great example, which is don't give people too many choices. If you build products, you know that providing a user experience or user interface that gives people too many options can be overwhelming and confusing. And what I noticed, though, the book went a lot deeper. It talked about all of these other ideas and concepts of what drives human behavior that I wasn't aware of. So then I was like, okay, well, there must be companies that are integrating a lot of this behavioral science into the work that they do. And I went searching and I found no one. And that's where my journey really began. And I started to really understand what drove human behavior and attempted to figure out ways to integrate that into the way that we design and build products. And that started me on my journey to Decoding the Why, which is the book that I wrote, and then also what I do day to day.
Great. And in that book, you talk about your behavior first approach. Just so everyone on the podcast that's listening understands that, what is the behavior first approach, and how can you use it?
Yeah, so it really seeks to understand what drives human behavior before you build technology. Digital experiences at their core really human experiences, and I think oftentimes when we're building products, web and mobile apps, we just jump to building the interface or putting in features, and we don't really take the time to really understand what is the behavior that we want to drive and how do we drive that behavior, and then come up with the features. We're often oriented in a very feature first approach, and that's why oftentimes, which is why you see companies that build features and then you deploy them and none of your users use them, and you kind of run in circles.
That makes sense. So how do you build products then with that in mind? What would your first step be?
Yeah, so the first step is to do user research. And in my book, I talk about this concept of the say, do, why data. You want to conduct qualitative research first, collecting a lot of say data. So trying to understand why people think they do what they do. The problem with the say data is that we often aren't aware consciously of what drives our decision making. So a lot of it is inaccurate. We don't do it intentionally, but we make up stories as to why we did something or why we would do something in the future. But then take that say data and start to map them to the behavioral drivers and the behavioral science. So, for example, you're building a fintech app and you're asking people to save money, and you say, hey, listen, if I built this app and you subscribe to it, would you save at least 10% of your income every single month? And everyone's going to say yes, right? And then you go into the academic literature and you start to understand that actually saving money is really hard because our present bias, we overweight our present situation versus the future situation. So we have a hard time putting out money for a future instance. And then furthermore, there's this idea of loss aversion where we weigh the losses of something twice as great as a potential gain, right? So if I'm walking down the street and I lose $10, the pain that I feel from losing the $10 actually feels like 20. When you start to understand that even though people are saying one thing, that's actually not really going on underneath the hood. And then if you look into the academic literature, you start to understand some of these concepts. And then you start to say, okay, well, what are some ways that I can sort of overcome this loss aversion, right? I can overcome this present bias, and then start to build concepts based on that rather than when people are telling you. And then, it sounds simplistic. It's not this simplistic, but then you basically deploy them and test them and see what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting about the pain that you feel from losing $10 being amplified. You also talked about something that caught my attention, this idea of the hot hand. So you hear it often in basketball, or if someone shoots a bunch of shots in a row, they tend to get it to that person again. And I thought that was really interesting because it's kind of an illusion, right?
Yeah, it's a complete illusion. It's a sort of like hot hand fallacy, right? And like we all eventually regress back towards our mean, right? And in basketball, you see this all the time. If somebody is quote unquote on fire, they keep feeding them the ball, right? And there's a lot of bias built into that too. When you're successful, when I'm successful, it's because of my hard work. When somebody else is successful, it's because of their luck. So there's a lot sort of packed into that hot hand fallacy and how that plays into product design.
No, that's really interesting. All right. So in the book, you are talking about product market fit, and our listeners are probably in some cases trying to figure that out. So what would you say to them about product market fit and how they should maybe approach that?
Yes. I will tell you, because I work with startups day in and day out, one of the biggest mistakes that I see startups make is they create a solution or put a solution in market and they don't really understand the problem that they solve. And then they put the solution in market, it's not getting the traction that they hoped it would get, and they're convinced it's a marketing issue. And they spend a lot of money putting into marketing. And then they end up in what I call the sort of solution looking for a problem mode. And I would say first and foremost is really understand the problem that you're trying to solve, the nitty gritty of it, come up with multiple ways to solve that problem and then test those. And then the second biggest mistake is their assumption that the solution that they're building is what is needed to solve that problem. And they'll spend 6 or 12 months and $500,000 to $1 million building out the first iteration of their solution to only deploy it and then figure out it's actually not resonating with the market. And there are a number of different ways to get pieces of your solution or idea into market really quickly to test and validate whether it actually has resonance in the market.
That makes sense. And, you also talk about a couple different levers to get people to, once you kind of figure out that it is sticking, there's a number of different ways to keep it kind of present in people's minds. And you talked about a bunch of different things. We can talk about them kind of different, different portions here, but like rewards being one of them, and using rewards to kind of build that into the product effort. How would you approach that? Like there's rewards, there's streaks, which I think is really interesting because I'm a very streaky kind of person. Like if you're working out, I try to keep it consistent, and you break the streak, and gosh, it's really easy to fall off the wagon. And I think you even talk about that actually about fitness. So love to get your take on some of these tools or tactics that people can use to kind of get people's behavior to kind of fall in line with the product that you're building.
Yeah, it's a really interesting concept. And one of the places I dig into this in my books around like what is probably colloquially referred to as this idea of gamification. And I think that when people want to get people to use their app, one of the things I often hear is like, let's gamify the experience. And there's a lot to unpack there and why certain gamification models work and other ones don't. And I just want to hit on one concept really quickly that I think is really important to understand. When you think about rewards, they're broken down to two key components. So there's intrinsic motivators, which is you are driven to complete a task because of the inherent satisfaction you get from completing that task, right? I run my company. I mean, I make money, obviously, but really what I do it is like innate sense of curiosity. I'm intrinsically motivated. Extrinsic motivators are external rewards, right? You get some sort of badge, or you get a reward, or you get $1 for completing some task. You're motivated to complete that task because something is being given to you, or there's something to achieve externally. And it's really important when you're trying to motivate users to complete an action to understand, is the action intrinsically motivated or extrinsically motivated? Because, and Daniel Pink actually talks about this in one of his books, if you introduce extrinsic rewards into an intrinsically motivated task, it can actually backfire. And I think you see this a lot in like health apps and fitness apps where like you're trying to provide rewards for some sort of task that should be intrinsically motivated. And that's a really key concept to keep in mind. Mm-hmm. The other thing is really understanding the mechanics of game design. And I'll give you a really quick example of how something as interesting as a leaderboard can backfire. So everyone's like, oh, well, let's gamify my app. Like, let's build in a leaderboard where we sort of rank people and show people in competition against one another. For anyone out there who's ever played Mario Kart, one of the things that you notice is when you're playing Mario Kart, if you're ever behind, all of a sudden you get these power-ups. You get mushrooms and these rockets to get you ahead. And there's something built into game design called dynamic game balancing. And the idea is basically if anyone's ever too far ahead or too far behind, the game balances in real time. So you feel like you're always in the race, and that drives motivation. And one of the ways that leaderboards can actually backfire is if you're so far ahead or so far behind, you start to lose motivation because you're quote unquote out of the race. And that's just a perfect example of how you can't just take like gamification models and just bake them into your app. You really have to understand the mechanics of what drives behavior, because if you don't, you might actually introduce some type of design concept into your app that actually has the wrong effect that it was intended.
That makes sense. And I think in that same regard, you talked about like balancing, right? Dynamic game difficulty balancing, or that, I think
Yes.
that's what, yeah. And so that kind of helps level the playing field a little bit to keep people's interests, I guess you could say, if they're not totally out of the picture,
Right.
they can kind of get back in it somehow.
Right. Exactly.
I like that. And there was a couple others too, like with the streaks. If you're streaking and all of a sudden you don't work out in a day or something, there's which app was it? There's some app that does like streak freezing, right?
Yeah, Duolingo. So like streaks
Right.
are great, actually tapping back into that concept of loss aversion, because
Right.
we don't like losing stuff. So you build up streaks, right? And the reason you don't break the streak is because you don't want to lose all the streaks you've accumulated. But again, one of the ways that it can backfire is if you miss one day, you're like, oh, I just lost all of that hard work. So Duolingo goes, interesting. Like we can leverage this idea of dynamic game balancing and streaks, like give you the ability to basically say, hey, listen, if you made a mistake, it's actually okay. You're not out of the game. You can freeze your streak.
No, that makes sense. And that should keep people involved a little bit more. Okay. So, so let's see, we talked about a couple different tools there. I guess one of the big things underlying, themes, I guess you could say, is communications. And there's a lot of different ways to communicate, and it obviously impacts behavior. So wanted to talk to you a little bit more about maybe some of the things that you've learned or wanted people to learn from this book, as far as how to cater your communications to the people you're trying to build for. I think you used an example of Acorn, for example. There was there's this weird thing that happens with your brain when you see a $5 a day contribution versus a $150 monthly contribution. You might tend to go towards the $5 thinking it's less, but ultimately it's probably similarly priced. So I wanted to just get your take on like, how do you like hone in on that with people and when you're building product?
Yeah. So framing, the way that options are presented or framed, can have a big impact on what it is that we decide. The classic example is I always give is like you walk into a grocery store, there's two cartons of ice cream, and one is 80% fat free, one is 20% fat. Same amount of fat content, but the first one sounds attractive, the second one doesn't. And words matter, and they matter a lot in the way that things are framed. And it's really important. A lot of times you'll hear in behavioral science and in product design, they'll use something called a loss framing, which is basically instead of framing something as a potential gain, you frame it as a potential loss. And this isn't a blanket statement, but in some instances can help drive behavior. So it's really important that even words matter. And one of the examples I give from my book is there was a product that basically was asking people to give some of their, after they pass away, some of their wealth to this nonprofit. And one of the pieces that he realized was he was having a big drop off during the application flow. And at first he thought it was because of just the UI UX, like all of us would, right? It must not be easy to complete. And he did some deep dive and some digging, and he found out there's something called mortality salience, which is anytime somebody mentions anything about death, there's a sort of reaction that you have to avoid any conversation around it.
Right. Shut off. Don't talk. We can't talk about it anymore. No, we're not talking about death. Yeah, right. I get it.
Exactly.
I think is that the one you're talking about?
Yeah, it was around giving docs, and he changed it from this death frame language to this idea of leaving your legacy. And that one switch of just a couple words in one of the questions, all of a sudden you saw conversion rates increase, right? And it's like a prime example of, we're so wired to think that anytime we're having an issue with the product, it's because of the UI, right? And this says that there might be actually something on a behavior level that's going on that we're not aware of.
Right. And that's just simple words. I mean, the way they framed it, like, nothing more. Words matter, and especially when you're building product. All right. So let's talk about storytelling. It's an important part of life, business. If you're out pitching your product or, trying to do sales or anything within the business side of it, building your product, you're gonna have to create and share a powerful story of why you built it and capture your audience. So you talk about storytelling in the book, and I would love to get your take on like maybe some tips or things to think about when you're creating that story.
Yeah, and I think this goes to the product. It also goes to like pitch decks and investor decks.
Yeah.
The way that we think about the world, and the way that we make sense of the world is through stories, and that we make decisions, whether we admit it or not, based on emotion a lot of the time. And we use data and numbers to sort of post-justify our decision or post-rationalize our decision. But there's actually some research that talks about this idea that we actually make the decision first and then we use numbers to justify it. And it is really important that you understand the sort of key building blocks of how stories are built and framed. And I talk about this in my book called The Hero's Journey, because if you can move somebody from making a decision based on numbers and statistics into sort of more of an emotional state, that's really when you can move people. And you see this a lot in startups, specifically early stage startups where there isn't as much data to prove traction yet. Oftentimes the people who are able to raise money are the people who are really great storytellers, not necessarily the person who has the best idea or the best product or the best market opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think one of the best people that's ever done that in the world was from WeWork, right? Like Adam Newman, right? He's raised probably more than anybody based off of vision and things. And obviously he's done, built some big companies and had some things not work out the way as he wanted to, but even more recently raised more. So are there others like him that you've seen or heard about that you're like, wow, this is an amazing storyteller?
Yes, there's just actually one post on Medium. It's called The Greatest Sales Deck Ever Written. And one of the things that he does, which I thought was fascinating, is instead of painting his product or his offering as the solution, he paints this future world that has changed dramatically. There's this new state of the world that is very different than today. And what that does is it creates this sort of fear of missing out for investors of the world is changing and I need to be there and I'm going to be left behind. And then he positions his solution as the vehicle to achieve that new world, right? And it's a really interesting framing around a story and a narrative that isn't around like the product and the success of the product per se, but it frames the narrative and the story around this new world is coming. And if you don't want to get left behind, my product, my vehicle, my rocket ship is the only way to get you there.
That's great. We'll have to link that up. It's on Medium, you said?
Yeah, I gotta find, I can't remember Kratos pitch.
Yeah, we'll check it out. We'll link it in the show notes for folks to find it later. All right, so moving along here, that we'd love to check that out. Storytelling is super important. And then obviously body language and even other cues can be really important. And this actually resonated for me because we've been, for a while there, we were using Zoom for a couple of years there due to the pandemic. And one of the things that your book says, and I just didn't realize is, eyes matter. Your eyes are super important when it comes to communicating, and obviously body language too. So wanted to get your take on, while we're doing all these Zoom calls, what are some things people could do to, obviously continue to better connect with people? And then obviously in person, what are things people can do from a, using their body and eyes to better communicate?
Definitely. So a couple things. Number one is, yes, eyes hold about 80% of information in regards to our emotional state. So if you actually take a photo and you blank out the entire face and just show the eyes, you can still understand the emotional state of the person. So that's a really key piece to hang on. Number two is stories. Stories. Like every time I talk about something or a theory or a concept, I always try to use a narrative or a story to highlight the point. It resonates more, people grab onto it. The third piece is, and I actually didn't get into this in my book, but there's something called the halo effect. And basically what it talks about is the presentation of a product or a service or an item, how it looks and feels can impact somebody's perception of the quality of that product in a completely different domain, right? So for example, let's say, Frank, that I gave you two identical software products to use, okay? One had a beautiful homepage, right? And the other one had a very blank homepage. And then you use the product. You actually would rate the quality and the experience of the product itself, independent of the homepage, as higher with the one that you saw that was beautifully sort of designed. And this is really important. And this gets back to like the idea that there's actually academic research to back up this idea that like brand actually has a real impact, right? So if you think about like a sales deck or a pitch deck, for example, like I cannot tell you, even if people say it doesn't matter, how much it actually impacts people's perception of the quality of your startup just by having like a polished brand presentation deck.
Yep. No, I 100% agree. So obviously design, super important, worth paying for, whether it be website design, everything, right? Like everything you're doing with your company matters from a design perspective, because that is your outward facing kind of, it's your eyeballs, right, of your product. And people are going to read that any way they can to kind of figure out, is this something I want to work with or use or buy or whatever. So that's great advice. Okay, so obviously the underarching theme in this book is behavioral science and kind of the importance of it. And can you share a little bit more about where you see that going with product development in the next 5 to 10, 15 years down the road here?
Yeah, so I think a few places. I think that as technologies become cheaper and more accessible, companies that are looking to get an edge, there's this whole other side of the equation. When you're building something, the question often is like, how can we make something more sophisticated and how can we make it faster, right? But there's this whole overlooked side of the equation, which is like, what drives human behavior? And I think companies that really start to keen on and understand that, you see actually a lot of corporations, large companies starting to have behavioral science teams. That's where the edge is going to be. So that's one piece. The other big opportunity that I see this is we're starting to see a lot of web and mobile apps that are focused on really behavior change, right? Helping people to save more money, learn a new skill, improve their health and wellness. This combined with the rise of wearables, so Apple Watches and Whoop bands and Oura rings that are able to collect this biometric real-time data and then feed that data back to users in real time, which you're already seeing. The big gap that we're seeing right now is getting people to actually change their behavior based on that information. That's where there's going to be a really big opportunity too, because with so much more data available, and this is not just in the wearable space, this is just like period. What we've been doing is we've just been throwing more data at users, and like, I'm not confused because I work in it every day, but I can guarantee you, like, the average person like doesn't need more numbers, and that's not going to change their behavior. So the question becomes like, well, what can you do to change the behavior?
Right. That's a great point. At one point, we've got so much information. What do we do? Like, it's just overload at this point. I mean, I'm wearing multiple different devices on my, to basically track things. I mean, what is it that we're going to do with all that data? That's super interesting. Yeah. And I think not just from like a wearable perspective, but I guess online as well, and mobile usage, all that kind of stuff. So great point. We're coming here close on time, so I'm going to kind of wrap it up with a couple questions here. I guess you've been a founder now, and obviously worked for some other organizations as well. What is the best advice you could give to some of the founders out there that are out building new products?
It sounds so simplistic, but I see this mistake so many times, is like, get out in front of your users or your customers as early as possible. Like, it amazes me how many times I talk to like first-time entrepreneurs or early entrepreneurs, and they've done all of the market research. They've read all the McKinsey reports, but they haven't talked to one customer. Wow. Like, the McKinsey reports are great if you're like IBM and Apple and trying to figure out like what markets you want to attack, but like, you're not. Like, your goal is to get from 0 to 1 to 5 to 10 to 20 to 30 customers. And the only way that you're going to do that, the fastest way, is like, get out in front of customers early and often. Because I can tell you, 90 to 95% of the assumptions that you have that are based on that McKinsey report that you read are going to be wrong. And you want to find out sooner rather than later.
Great advice. So get out there and talk to people, find your customers, and continue to build around that.
And don't talk to people you know. That's the worst thing you can do. My mom, she loves me, but I can put anything in front of her and she's going to tell me it's the greatest idea that she's ever seen.
Moms are awesome that way.
Yeah.
But you're right. Get an objective person outside of your mom or family network. Great idea.
Exactly. A random person you don't know that is willing to pay for what it is that you're offering.
Great. Awesome. All right. So your book is out. Where's the best place for people to find it?
Amazon. Just go to Amazon, Decoding the Why, and grab a copy on Amazon.
All right, great. And then if anyone wanted to connect with you in some way, what's the best place to find you?
Nate at Effectual Ventures, EFFECTUAL Ventures.co.com.
All right. Thanks so much for the conversation, Nate. Really appreciate you joining us. Congrats on the book. And hopefully our listeners found it super helpful and you're out there, building products based on behavior that can help change the world. And if you enjoyed the conversation, please do share it with your network. And obviously, they could even get a free book out of it if they really like reading or want to learn more about behavioral science and the things that are kind of tying into building products. And sharing is caring, of course, as well. And that's the episode actually today. So hopefully you found it helpful, interesting. And if you have a startup idea, guess what? Today is the best day to start up, not tomorrow, not the next day. Today, get it going, get it started. And in doing so, I encourage you to join our community for access to support, expert advice, and all the resources you need to elevate your startup by simply going to startupoftheyear.com or soty.link/apply and join our community today. It's free. There's a lot of benefits, and it's a lot of fun too. So until next time, I'm Frank Gruber. Don't forget to hug your loved ones, and good luck out there starting up. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Startup of the Year podcast. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll be back with another episode soon.